Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I am going to show you a little bit of what I know about watercolor. I do watercolor paintings. I will insert some images right now of some of the things I've painted so you could just get a quick look of it. I'm going to try showing you several techniques today, but I'm not sure if I'm doing it in one video or two. It depends on how long each one takes me. So all of these are going to add some kind of texture to your paper. And that's what I'm trying to show right now. I'm not showing how to do watercolor. I'm just showing you several techniques that could add some kind of interest to your backgrounds, like blooms or salt. You might be able to do trees with sponge or brush on. So there's a bunch, and I hope that you enjoy the video and you find it very useful. Now, the first one we're going to do is the salt. I'm going to use kosher salt, which is probably ideal. But if you don't have that and you have table salt, you could definitely use that. You'll just get smaller texture rather than something big. So I'll show it to you. I am going to use a Payne's Gray, so hopefully we could all see this. The dampness of the paper does matter. I'm going to show you, this is quite wet. This is probably not good yet. And by that, I mean that if it's too wet, the water will overtake the salt. There'll be too much water for the salt to make any effect. So I'm going for not sopping wet, but a nice sheen. Right now, if you can see it at all, I have my light. This looks a little too wet for me. It's kind of pooling a little bit, and I think that it will just oversaturate the salt. So I just wait several seconds. It's not a long wait, because if you wait too far, then it's too dry. So right now, if you can see, I'm not sure you can see the difference at all. This is more of a sheen rather than sopping wet. So I am going to begin adding the kosher salt to the page. And I just sprinkle it anywhere. For me, I like it to be as organic as possible. On this side, I'm just adding the table salt. So we are going to let this dry, and you could see in a couple of spots, it looks like it might have been too dry. I might not get a result, but that's the fun of working with salt. And you could see anytime that the salt turns the color, anytime the salt turns the color of your paint, that part was too wet. If it's a variation like a lighter gray, that means I might get a response. With the table salt, I'm not as experienced, so I don't really know how much of a reaction we're going to get. I see a bunch of little lighter colored spots, so I think we are going to get a reaction. So in this case, now we have to wait for this to dry. We do not remove the salt until it is absolutely completely dried. The salt could be used in multiple ways. This would be really good for a sky if you want to add some kind of interest, but I use this mostly with backgrounds. So when I'm adding like a bunch of green in the back and I don't really want a lot of detail on my page, I will add salt, and it adds some sort of differentiation in the green that I'm using. So that adds some kind of interest to my page. Now, with the salt, you don't need to completely saturate that paper. So that could be used in quite a few coloring books, or any coloring book that allows you to use a water medium. Next, I'm going to show you what blooms look like. I think that you probably already have some experience with this if you've worked with watercolor. Most of the time they're accidental and it's not something I am trying to do, but we want to today do this purposely. With the blooms, you are wetting the paper a little bit more. You could try it in different levels of wetness, so you could see what kind of result you get. Again, this is something that you're wetting quite a bit, but not fully saturating the paper. Like the salt, this is a timing situation. If you do it too early, you don't get a bloom. If you do it too late, it's too dry and you won't get a bloom. So that's why I said in the beginning that a lot of this for the blooms for me is accidental. And what I do right now, you can still see there's a lot of puddling. Like right around here, you can see the color is still puddling. And see how easily it moves? You can see the paint is moving there. That means it's still a tiny bit too wet. But we're gonna do it at different stages right now so we could see what kind of result, if any, we get. So right now, I think this is a little too wet, but this side seems a little less wet than this side, so I'm gonna try here. All I do is take water, clean water preferably, and just add drips. Now, it is too wet. See how it's not really creating a round bloom? It's traveling a little. So this is not quite ready. I now have my first side that looks more like a sheen to me, and I'm gonna drop a drop. I'm gonna drop a little bit of a bigger one. And that's my biggest. Now, you can see in the one where I felt more confident that it is a sheen rather than wet, we are getting a bloom. And a bloom just means that there's a difference between the dryness of the paper and the amount of water that you're adding. When there's a difference between the two, you get what's called a bloom, which means the water is actually pushing out the watercolor. So it's taking the pigment and pushing it outward. Okay, I still think that needs another few seconds. That still looks pretty wet to me. Okay, I'm gonna try it on this one. I still think I'm a little premature, but let's give it a shot. Yeah, we're probably really close to being too damp. It has created the dispersion of the paint. It's dispersing, but it's not as vivid as these two. So when that happens, I still keep this in my art or in my coloring pages because it still is adding an interest, but I will wait several more seconds to get a better result. So maybe your first drop is in a corner where it's not as noticeable, and when you start seeing that your paint is ready, you go ahead and add more in the center. Let's try again, right here. That one works nicely. So that is one that I like. Let's try adding it to this really wet part and see what happens. See how it's puddling? It's not gonna do anything. So right now we have about, we have a few blooms. So I think this is good enough for us to have the idea of what happens when we add water to, let's say, our background. And I think that this is a really good technique if you want to add in a sky, you want something to look like maybe it's has some cloud coverage in it. You could add more water. It's also good for oceans. You know, you put your blue down, you start adding dots, and it gives you like the variations that are natural in water. Like when the light hits the ocean, you're going to see different variations of color. You might see darker and lighter greens or blues, depending on where you live. So I like using it for both. So that is our salt and our bloom so far. The next watercolor technique for texture that I'm going to show you is a sponge-on technique. Now this is usually on dry paper. What I have on the side is a palette with some paint in it. It is wet, but my sponge itself is dry. I'm not using a really special sponge. I am just fast dip, maybe 2 if you don't see a lot of paint. And then I just sponge. And that's all I do. And then I get maybe a little more paint. But sometimes I do a different color. I'm doing blue here. I probably should have done green, so you could see that this could be a tree. Sorry, this is going to be really bad drawing, but all right. There's your trunk. Here are your leaves. When it dries, you'll have a variation because of the different amount of paint that you put on your sponge. Also, if you added, like I did, a little bit of a darker blue, along with the blue I just used. I don't treat this really delicately. I just grab my sponge, grab some colors, dip it again. Try that. You know, if you know that, okay, shadows are more likely to be on the bottom leaves than the top ones, you could make the bottom ones darker like I just did. If you don't have a sponge of any kind, but you have, let's say, an old washcloth like I do here, and it has some kind of texture on it, you could do this as well. I just scrumble it up in some sort of haphazard way, and I do the same thing I just did. I dip into my paint. Okay, that's not wet enough. I am going to try doing the green now, just so we could kind of see that, you know, I have some bushes and how do you create bushes. So I have made some green paint on the side. I am going to get my rag again that has texture to it. I'm just going to ball it up and I'm going to just dip it into the paint. So you could see I got a lot here, very little there. Let's see what it does. Okay, it's starting to add some texture. Looks like I don't have nearly enough paint. So that's my first layer. Then I usually get a darker green. In this case, I'll make it like a really different green and see what we get. Okay, so with this one, I am going to move to a different section. I would like to keep my colors separate. So I am just dipping into my new green. And sponging it on. So you don't actually need a sponge. Of course, the sponge is easier. So I try to get one, and I think most of us have some kind of sponge that we could use or even cut a corner of and just use a small piece. You don't need a large piece. Anything this small, 1 inch by 1 inch, is plenty. The next technique I'm going to use is deceptively simple to look at, but it is not always that easy to achieve. It was something I had to practice. So right now, I have a wet brush. I'm gonna dry as much of it as I can. I don't want a completely dry brush, although you could do it that way. Sorry, I was shaking the camera there. but the paint is already wet, so I don't want a wet brush because then the wet brush will add water to the paint and then you won't be able to get a dry result. So what I usually do is just get some paint. I usually make this paint a little thicker. So see how it's not rolling around? So that's what I usually do. You take a flat brush. Not sure if it could be done with a round one. I've never tried it actually, so it's possible that it can. It's just this is easier. You keep it on the side and you slowly brush lightly across. This adds texture to your backgrounds. If you're doing a space theme and you want to get some different colors in here, you can dry brush them in. If you want to do multiple colors, like let's say different variations of blue because you're trying to do some kind of sky effect or a space effect and you want to add different colors, you need to make sure that each layer is completely dry because the more moisture you add, the less texture you're going to get. So again, the more water, the less texture. And that's why we try to dry off our brush as much as possible. So I'm going to rinse off this color. So I have to do the same thing I did before with my rag. I have to completely dry this off. Well, not completely, you know what I mean. Well, maybe you don't. You have to dry this off as much as you possibly can. So I am pressing a tiny bit and I'm pulling. And this feels just slightly damp. So now I'm going to mix my next color. I think I'm going to do a purple so we could see the difference in the layers that I'm going to add. So let me get a purple going. And I use a spray bottle like this. You could get them from the dollar store. This someone gave me as a Ranger. So I think this probably cost a little bit more. But honestly, it doesn't do anything that I couldn't get it from a dollar store. This is not one of the ones that does like little tricks. I think some of them like have more patterns or something like that. And that's not what I'm going after right now. So I just use a regular spritzing bottle. Now I mixed this paint more watery. See how it's moving in the palette? Let's see if I could get the same reaction. It's still thicker, and there are people that could explain it much better than I do. This one is like a cream, like half and half if you're in North America. You know, heavy cream. It's creamier rather than watery. So I'm just dipping my brush in like I normally would. Since this one is more fluid, I am getting rid of the excess on the side. Let's see what happens. Again, it's going to be side brush. We're not brushing down. We're using the side of our brush. Okay, see how this is too wet. See how it went all the way across and did not create a texture. This is not intentional. However, good to know. This is what you should not do. So this is obviously either the brush is too wet, which I don't think that's what it was. Honestly, I think I just have too much water in the paint. So I'm now going to try to make the paint thicker and just keep adding more paint until I get an even creamier texture, probably more like a full cream or a double cream. But this is not nearly as dry as my first one. So let's see if we get anything on the second attempt. Okay, I'm just going to do a couple of more passes with my brush, and I'm not entirely sure it's just the paint. So just a couple more to feel the wetness. It still feels pretty damp, but I think we might be all right. So we're going to try it again. There we go. There we go. So now we have a little bit more texture. I will add a third layer of a third color, but I do need to let this dry. I think that might have been part of the reason I had a brush that may have been too damp. I don't think that was the case. I think it was the paint that was too wet, and I probably did not let this completely dry off. But you could see that the texture is still there anyway. You know, like as long as it's not sopping wet, you know, in this case, you now have a purple sky, but the texture underneath from the Payne's gray is still there. So let me give this a couple of seconds to dry, and then I'll come back. Okay, this time I mixed a pink, and I made it as thick as I did the first one. So let's hope it works. Wasn't completely thrilled with the purple reaction. I mean, I still got some texture on here, but like some of the lines may be a little too thick for me if I'm going for a galaxy. But by the time you're done adding all of your colors, I don't think that'll be really noticeable. And who knows, you know, maybe the different textures in the sky are what makes it so interesting. I think that's why a lot of watercolor artists actually do use this technique, or all of these techniques, because it does add interest to the page. So again, I'm just going to the side of my brush, lightly, lightly, lightly across the page. And maybe this is not the best color to see the difference over these. Ooh, okay, that was way too much paint. Let's try up here. There we go. That's better texture. So in this case, we've got 3 colors on here, and we're starting to see like a really nice look. Like maybe not where I made the mistakes, like ignore that, but all around here, it looks kind of interesting. So that's dry brushing. And in some cases more useful than what I showed you up on top. This does sometimes need more water than a book can handle. So you have to be really careful. You have to know your paper. If it's a thicker cardstock or watercolor paper, of course you could use the top more wet medium. If you have something like that's Amazon printed that may not take any water at all, the dry brushing and the sponge on work because it doesn't require more than a tiny, tiny bit of water on your brush. And it doesn't need more than that. So I think you could use this more on difficult papers than you can with the top 2 techniques. Okay, I'm back. I've done a really poor galaxy background here. I just plopped on some color. I didn't even try. Sorry about that, but I was kind of rushing, and hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm going to do anyway. But in frame, I've placed the palette so you can see. Some of these are completely dry, but I won't be using 1, 2, 3. I'll be using about 3 colors, I think. So first, as you may recall me saying earlier, this requires a really, really light pressure. We're just going to be using the side of the brush and brushing across. Sometimes I hold it differently, like I am here, rather than how I usually hold a brush, like I do a pencil. I switch up how I am holding it so that I am less likely to press down hard. I don't know if that's really going to work today, but let's give it a shot. So let me dip into the green first, and I am going to dip very lightly. This is a mostly dry brush. It is very, 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 very slightly damp because it has been drying for some time. So I'm not really too sure how wet, but it's pretty dry. So I'm going to be taking my brush really lightly going across. You could always adjust your pressure if you feel like you're not getting any color at all. My brush is much drier than I thought it was, so I'm pressing quite hard, but you can see it's still adding color. So all you do is adjust either the dampness of your brush, or maybe I've made this paint too dry. So I've mixed up a little bit more paint. Let's see what I get. I am going to tap this on a rag that I have on the side. I don't want to add too much paint. Okay, I decided not to go straight across. I want to just add different textures throughout my paper. As this brush is drying, I compress heavier. As you saw there, it was a little damp, and you can still see it's damp because I was able to move the paint. So here I've added some green to my galaxy. Let's try some more purple. It's very possible that my black or my Payne's gray is a little too wet. So again, I'm going to try tapping here to see if it is. It's a little wet. Yeah, it's wet. The paint is too wet in this case. Let me try drying it. So I think this is a better example than this was, to show you what this technique can do. We took what looked like a plain background and we've now added some points of interest to it. Whether we're using this in a galaxy, or we could use this in, like, let's say a row of bushes. We want to add different colors to it, or we just want to add some kind of interest, point of differentiation. We can dry brush. So up close, you can see, or I hope you can on camera, the way I can in person, see all of the texturing that's going on in here. You know, between lines, things that look more like lines, things that look more like a color separation or speckling. You know, it just makes it more fun to look at. Or at least I think it does. So I hope this is better than my first example, but it does give you an idea of a watercolor technique that you can use to add texture to your coloring pages. Before moving on, I want to show you the results of the bloom and the salt. Now, we got a really good texture. This is the left side, or my left side here, is the kosher salt. You can see that it makes much bigger looking, like I call them ice crystals because that's kind of what they look like to me. But it does add a beautiful texture to the paper, and it could be very interesting in backgrounds or in large areas. Now, we did get a pretty cool result here, even with the regular table salt. You can see where I put in a lot of salt. It's just like a very slight speckled look. Where some of the salt was less dense, it made a similar pattern to what we have in the kosher salt. So again, tinier in some spots, but a beautiful texture. I mean, think about using this on a galaxy, right? You're adding all of your colors. You're still you have that sheen on it. It's not soaking wet. You throw salt all over it and you get this wild pattern. I mean, to me, it is absolutely gorgeous. So I hope you like the salt. The blooms came out pretty interesting too, especially if I turn it a little. Where the water pushed the pigment out, it made what I'm going to call like a landscape, kind of like this could be trees, right? These could be clouds in your sky. You don't know how to do clouds, or you want just a wispy cloud. You use the water on your watercolor to create blooms, and you get these really interesting feathery kind of results. So I think that would look really cool in a sky. It would look really cool if you're doing some kind of trees in the background. You put a bunch of blooms or a bunch of dots of water going across, and you get what I'm calling a tree line. I mean, it's, very abstract tree line, but you get the idea that it adds kind of like a cool texture to your paper. Then with the sponge on technique, this looked the way it looked pretty much. You get, just a speckled look, and you could add more and more layers. Of course, the more you add, the denser it's going to get, and the less tree-like it'll look, right? Because it'll look like this looks like there are leaves, and you can do branch lines if you wanted to, like through here. You do like a branch, and it shows that, okay, this is where the branches went, and that's why these are all tree leaves all the way around. So I really like the way that came out. My dry brush, honestly, I don't think is really showing the full capacity of what this can do. Yeah, I think this video has gone on long enough that I think I'm just going to wait and do a part 2 of this and do my next 4 texturing techniques using watercolor in a separate video. So I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider subscribing or liking it if you enjoyed it. So thanks. I hope to see you in the next video. Take care, guys. Bye.